The Gleiwitz incident in 1939, where a staged attack justified their invasion of Poland. In 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor triggered the Axis alliance obligations, which led Germany and Italy to declare war on the United States. Do you understand? Do you see how this all ties together? Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Checho, and I am very excited to be delivering part 2 of my false flag extravaganza. This one focusing on World War II and the 5, what I call primary false flags of that war, many of which even I had not heard of and were shocking to learn. So stick around. I've got a bunch of fantastic information for you and some real history. Let's begin with something simple. What is a false flag? False flag is an operation, a covert act, a, quote, conspiracy, designed to deceive, where actions are made to appear as if they're being carried out by one party when in fact they are being carried out by another. So it dates back to, the days of the pirates. Pirates learned that, hey, if we hang a British flag up, they'll let us get real close, false flag. That's kind of as far back as I know that the term goes. But these days, we see it being manifested in every which way. And as I look back over the last 100 years, and even more, it's just unbelievable how nothing has changed. So, historically speaking, false flags have been used to escalate every single global conflict, and I mean used ad nauseum. World War II, believe it or not, we saw, and I'm going to lay this out for you, both sides using false flags to generate the kind of energy and national sentiment to head into what became a global world war like the world had not seen before. Propaganda. So the Axis and the Allied powers both used the same dirty tricks on their civilians, on their population. So I'm going to lay out 5 different events, some of which you heard of, that are going to showcase how both the Allied powers and the Axis powers use the same dirty tactics to convince their people and their government and their armed forces that the time to fight was now or never. First, let me set the stage so you can have everything in context. Post-World War I, there was a lot of punitive measures being put into place and a lot of economic instability. We had the Treaty of Versailles and German reparations, which, in case you don't recall, were extreme by any measure. Everyone who read the headline about German reparations, had a moment, because it would be like the equivalent of like $500 billion today to levy. I mean, maybe that's not even, maybe 500 trillion these days, since we're just printing money as we go, or not printing money, but making it up. So the Treaty of Versailles, what I want you to understand, and as you delve further and further into the true history of these events, you're going to see that the Treaty of Versailles was methodically designed to crush Germany under reparations, to force them into certain actions. It was destabilizing, and it created massive resentment among Germans who were being just saddled with this crushing debt in a war which, if you had listened to my previous podcast about the false flags of World War I, you would know they had already won. They had already won World War I. America had to be duped into being involved to salvage that war for the British. And anyway, we're going to get into it. So we had massive economic reparations, harsh conditions, and this, of course, fuels national ideologies. And it set the stage for Hitler's rise as he became the Führer and the savior. It was economic revival that Germany was after, and they were humiliated after World War I. So this created a cycle of dependency, if you will. Europe's post-war economy was held together by this precarious system of German reparations paid to the Allied powers, largely financed by who? Guess who? Guess who? Loans from the United States. If I recall, it was Alan Dulles. Was it Dulles? The same shyster criminal bankers sat on and oversaw the Treaty of Versailles that are responsible for some of the most heinous things in American history. The same people. So that created the conditions for Europe's post-war economy. And it was held together by a thread. This dependence left Europe's financial stability tethered to what? American capital. And when the Great Depression hit, the whole house of cards collapsed. So, United States financiers, bankers, J.P. Morgan and Company, they orchestrated what is known as the Dawes and Young plans. And this stabilized, I'm using air quotes for everyone listening along, stabilized Germany with loans, but it bound it to American economic interests, okay? And this created a financial dependency that was going to unravel as soon as 1929 came and the crash hit. Harriman, sound familiar? Walker and Bush. This is the trifecta from Hell and Misery. Through Brown Brothers Harriman, these parasite financiers, like the Harriman brothers, the Walkers, the Bush family, they invested heavily in German industrial leaders like their favorite guy, Thyssen. Remember that name? So these investments not only propped up Germany's economy, but also underpinned its rearmament. And make no mistake about it, rearmament was exactly what they were after. And so as you go through these pages of history, it becomes very illustrated how, these moguls, they're criminals as far as I'm concerned. They allowed their capital to flow right into Nazi Germany, knowing what was going on with it full well. America, and as many people are waking up to the fact that America had massive ties to Nazi Germany, ties in every industry. Ford, General Motors, IBM, the massive profits from German operations. Ford and GM produced vehicles that were used by the German military in the war to fight Americans. IBM provided technology that became absolutely vital to Nazi record keeping. Most people are aware of that. And Standard Oil, the Rothschild-funded Rockefeller special, Standard Oil, without Standard Oil, there is no rise of Hitler. There is no, World War II would have been deflated before it ever got a chance to get off the ground. Standard Oil was a linchpin to Germany, a linchpin. Now, why would the Rothschilds and Rockefellers do that unless they had ulterior motives? Don't think they didn't know exactly what they were doing with their money, because they did. When you invest that much money, you think you don't know where it's all going? Of course you do. You're taking no chances with it. And the Rothschilds don't take chances like that anyway. So, Standard Oil's fuel technology, critical to Germany. Without it, no World War II. That I can say with confidence. And of course, this deepened the financial and industrial ties between U.S. capital and Nazi Germany's rearmament. Massive profits. So, setting the stage, 1929, that's the year of the Great Depression, the stock market crash. Now, there's been a lot of theories about manipulation and who may have been responsible for it. But some theorists suggest that our favorite parasite class to talk about, these financier oligarchs, may have just influenced the market crash. Which it led to a sudden withdrawal of U.S. loans from Europe, and that exasperated the global economic collapse, because the crash absolutely crippled Germany's economy. It was bad here. Imagine over there. You had they couldn't buy. They had a wheelbarrow when they needed to buy bread. That's how much money they needed to bring to the bakery. So imagine what that did over there. We know it was bad here. There's plays written about it. There's movies made about it. It was a dark time in the world. Somebody has that karma on their head, because like every economic crash, like every war, like every surprise terrorist attack, air quotes from my Audible listeners. These were orchestrated and methodically set up by the same parasite class. Know who the enemy is. As German unemployment and poverty surged, the Nazi Party's message of economic strength and national pride resonated more and more. Coincidence? Coincidence that Standard Oils was the primary funder of Hitler's campaign? Coincidence that they were the linchpin of the German economy and war machine and rearmament, and also the same people who own and run Standard Oil are the ones manipulating the stock market into a dumpster fire? There are no such thing as coincidences, my friends. This set the stage for the rise of Hitler, as I mentioned earlier. As Germany's savior, it also set the stage for rapid militarization. And that rapid militarization was fueled by foreign investment. Despite Hitler's clear intent and openly defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, he was not allowed to, according to that treaty, to build up Germany's military operations. And he was doing it, and we knew he was doing it, and they were profiting from it. American corporations and financiers maintained their investment in German industry, despite Hitler's clear intent and open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, because according to that treaty, he was not permitted or allowed to be rebuilding Germany's army. Do you understand? And everybody knew that he was. Everybody was shaking hands with him, winking at him, and you know, giving him the six-shooter, and they were fist-pumping with him because they were making a fortune with him. Not with him, but through him. Because, like so many other people, Hitler was, in many ways, a patsy. He was being used. The priority of profit over everything else enabled Germany's rearmament, illustrating the willingness of international capital to support basically anything they can make money off of, Nazi militarization included. All this, of course, regardless of any political consequences. So, this may be hard to believe for many of you, but again, America wished to remain neutral. And when I say America, I mean, of course, we the people. The sentiment in America was, we're not getting involved. You know, we did that once already. You know, while we didn't lose, we did lose a lot of lives. We lost a lot of sons and fathers and brothers. And so there was a strong isolationist or neutral sentiment in the United States. And Britain, at the time, was facing these tremendous Axis powers largely alone. So it did what it does. It launched an anti-isolationist campaign to sway American public opinion. British intelligence, through the British Security Coordination, that's an entity, used media outlets in Hollywood and forged documents to paint Britain as this embattled democracy standing alone against fascism. This propaganda effort helped soften U.S. Neutrality sentiment, and it paved the way for American aid, particularly through what was called the Lend-Lease program. Now, I'm going to ask you to keep in mind world events of today as they continue, and we see the same tactics echoed, the same propaganda, the same rinse and repeat tactics. It's just atrocious and unbelievable how much they just stick to the same exact playbook. Now, this leads us to our first false flag. Now, wait, just when you hear everything I have compiled about Pearl Harbor, you're going to be like, you're just going to be flabbergasted. I was, and I already knew a lot about it. But what I uncovered was just mind-numbing. But there is something that preceded Pearl Harbor, a massive false flag that I don't know how flew so far under my radar, perhaps because it was not American or English-speaking. But if you've never heard of Japan's Mukden incident, 1931, stick around. You're going to love this. This is crazy. I had no idea that other countries could be so diabolically inclined in a way that I thought maybe just us English-speaking countries were. But let me tell you about this, because you need to understand. This set the stage. This was huge, this false flag. So at the time, this was following the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan had won that war. They had gained control over the South Manchuria Railway and other interests in Manchuria. And it exerted considerable influence there, although this part was still technically under Chinese rule. It was Chinese owned. But they controlled the massive Japanese corporations, like the South Manchuria Railway Company, dominated the industry. And they needed this part to make sure that they were transporting the resources to keep their economy and their people going. So it was a big deal to Japan. They were very much economically dependent on these resources and raw materials. And that drove them to take, I guess you could say, desperate measures to solidify their control. Political instability in China at the time also had a lot to do with what Japan was able to get away with. So I have to tell you, for context, about this was the global rise of fascism and alliance formation, okay? Japan's expansionist ambitions aligned wonderfully with the nationalist and authoritarian ideologies emerging in Germany and Italy at that time. By the late 1930s, Japan's militaristic agenda resonated with the fascist goals of many European powers, laying the groundwork for the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. Have you ever heard of the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis? It's a doozy. Let's get to the Mukden incident. This is crazy. 1931, all right? The Japanese and their operatives, they bombed a section of their own railway, the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. Now it's Shenyang. And they falsely attributed to and accused Chinese forces of the act. And they portrayed it as a direct attack on Japanese interests and direct attack on Japanese people. That sounds... I wonder where they got that idea. Yeah. World War I, maybe? Probably before. Using that incident as pretext and justification and leveraging that incident in the eyes of the world, the Japanese army swiftly invaded Manchuria, and they met little resistance. And this led to the establishment of Manchukuo, which was essentially a Japanese puppet state, and it was used to further control resources and maintain military dominance in that region. All right? Wow, sounds so familiar. So this set a precedent, and I'm going to tell you why. After World War I, what was formed? What was one of the many objectives of manipulating nations into a global conflict? I'll tell you, in case you don't know. A unified global government has always been the name of the game. In case you have been living on the moon or are a complete coincidence theorist and find yourself listening to this podcast like you were watching some kind of train wreck. If so, buckle in. The fun's just getting started. The League of Nations, okay? This is the precedent. And I want you to listen and tell me if this sounds familiar with what's been going on today, last year, yesteryear, last decade, and basically every year since. The League of Nations was formed after World War I to create global peace, to avoid another global conflict, of course. Same reason why the United Nations was formed after World War II. Let me tell you why the League of Nations didn't work out, and you can figure out why the United Nations will soon fail as well. The League of Nations investigated the incident. Imagine that. Imagine a entity that investigated events like false flags and made reports on them, which it published to the world. Obviously, that was going to be a problem. Can you imagine if we had something like that in place for World War II? Every nation would have been screwed, okay? And I'm going to lay out exactly why I say that and how you know it's true. So this phony peace league entity investigated and reported on the wars that were started. Imagine like if it did that with its members now, United Nations, that'd be crazy. But so you're going to get a sense of why the League of Nations had to go the way of the dinosaurs and needed to be rebranded, and the rules needed to be changed. Because imagine if they had done a report like on the Lusitania or any of the other false flags of World War I. It would have been damning. And then if people understood it was their own nations manipulating and orchestrating these events to convince their sons and brothers and daughters and fathers to go to war and die, they probably would have said, no, thank you. No, thank you. We won't be going anywhere to fight for you. And you know what I'm saying? That's what would happen if people knew the truth. So clearly, this entity was going to fail. It published, the League of Nations, the Lytton Report in 1932, and it concluded that Japan was in fact responsible for the attack on itself. I seem to remember the United States orchestrating the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline and blaming Russia. Are we trying to start a war again? Yes, we are. Japan told the League of Nations to go pound sand, and it left. And that set a precedent, okay? Because the international response from the League of Nations, and many of them, was absolutely condemning of Japan's actions. But there was no concrete consequences, okay? And this highlighted the League's absolute inability and ineptitude to enforce any kind of peace. And this signaled to Japan, and later Germany and Italy, and right down the line, that aggressive territorial expansion could proceed with minimal to no interference at all. Belligerent and blatant disregard for international law and criminal justice was now a very big statement being made. And you can see that statement being carried out today. What is happening in Gaza right now? What is the international community saying and demanding happen, and who is stopping it? Nobody. Nobody. Okay. So, the ineffective response. So this impotent response from the League of Nations and Western powers, of course, emboldened Japan, and it set a precedent for Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and Germany's annexation of territories in Europe. So that by 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy formalized their alliance through the Tripatriot Pact, and that solidified the Axis powers. What else did it do, my friends? What else did it do? It also set a very clear precedent and playbook, a model for manipulation and justification of aggression and war. The Mukden incident became the precedent for false flags to start a war. It was echoed later by so many nations. Germany, in the Gleiwitz incident in 1939, where a staged attack justified their invasion of Poland. And we're going to get into that in just a minute, so stick around. Japan's alliance obligations and path to U.S. involvement. Okay, this is what we're going to get into next. And then I'm going to get into Pearl Harbor, so stick around. In 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor triggered the Axis alliance obligations, which led Germany and Italy to declare war on the United States. Do you understand? Do you see how this all ties together? And this series of events brought America into the European war theater, and it further globalized the conflict, which had begun as regional. Does it sound like anything that's going on right now? It does to me. I'm going to jump ahead to Pearl Harbor, and then I'm going to return to 1933. Bear with me, because we were just talking about Japan. I want to get into Pearl Harbor because it's obviously related. So, this is my favorite false flag to talk about because, of course, it's American and I'm American. But let me unveil to you what I've learned, and let's set the stage here, okay? We had President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Bush family relative. That's funny. Weren't the Obamas Bush family relatives? Oh, they were. That's right. They were. And Clintons were obviously longtime business partners with the Bushes. Yeah, it's amazing how they keep it in the family, you know. So Roosevelt, Bush family relative, was known as the man who strove in vain to ward off the war. And this is another falsification, of course. The Roosevelts and the Delanos are part of the parasites class bloodline. They go way back. President Roosevelt's grandfather, Warren Delano, was a major operator in the drug-running operation of the Russell family. Does that name sound familiar? Russell? It should, because they're the co-founders of the Skull and Bones Society. Russell Trust. Delano also worked in the drug networks of the British government in Asia, China, and the Far East in general. When Roosevelt was seeking re-election as president in 1940, stop me if you heard this one before, Woodrow Wilson, he said, while I'm talking to you, mothers and fathers, I give you one more assurance. I've said, why am I turning into Ronald Reagan? I'm sorry. While I'm talking to you, mothers and fathers, I give you one more assurance. I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Fucking politicians. Excuse my French. They lie as well as they breathe. So, clearly, they needed an event of such magnitude that they could justify America's involvement into the war, and that Roosevelt would be cleared of any of his responsibility for going back and reneging on his nonsense pledge, which he repeated over and over in his election campaign. So Roosevelt was of the parasite class. He was a typical puppet gopher. And he was to engineer an attack on the United States that would anger public's opinion and get people to go to war against the aggressor and also join the European conflict. Roosevelt would have been well schooled in manipulating public opinion with engineered events because, as a member of President Woodrow Wilson's administration in the First World War, as you recall from part 1 of this 2-part special, America was manipulated into that so-called Great War by ultra-Zionist agents of the Rockefeller and Rothschild cartel criminal clan. If you want to know how that was, you have to go back and watch part 1 of this and or check out my 4-part special with Gavin Nascimento, where I outline the details of all of that and more. And he does most of the work on that. God bless him. So, America, very wary of war. We had strong isolationist views. Roosevelt needed a direct provocation to shift public sentiment, but he faced a lot of limitations. A small yet influential pro-war media base influenced by the oligarchs and financiers who owned them, were profiting from defense industries, and this backed his more aggressive Pacific stance. But the tripartite pact, that was Germany joined forces with Italy and Japan and signed that pact, the tripartite pact, on September 27th, 1940. It became a political catalyst, and Roosevelt knew that a Japanese attack on American interests would absolutely motivate the Tripartite Act. When Germany and Italy signed this Tripartite Act, Germany, Italy, and Japan, on September 27th, 1940, it became a political catalyst. Roosevelt knew that a Japanese attack on American interests could activate mutual defense clauses in that pact, and that could pull the United States into both the Pacific and European theaters, and that was his goal. That's what he was put there to do. The people who put him there are the ones I've been referring to as the parasite class. So, when I tell you that Pearl Harbor was absolutely false flagged, how do I say that with such certainty? Because history will tell you that it's allegedly been false flagged. And YouTube is going to be more than happy to put up a little Wikipedia page on the bottom of this video, which you can see right now, that tells you what happened in Pearl Harbor, who was responsible. And that is the history they would have you know. But that is his story. And I'm going to lay out how we have just oodles and oodles of evidence which contradict their Wikipedia narrative control devices. I want to start with some of the bigger ones and get into the lesser ones. Okay, we have the McCollum Memo and the Richardson controversy. Let me tell you about why that stands as a bastion of proof that this was indeed absolutely a false flag. So, on October 7th, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum of the Office of Naval Intelligence outlined 8 strategies for provoking Japan, including keeping the U.S. fleet in Hawaii as a target. Roosevelt saw this as an opportunity to mobilize American support for the war. What does that sound like? God, that reminds me of something. 8 strategies for provoking Japan. Oh, I know. It reminds me of Operation Northwoods, when there was more than 8 strategies to provoke and or get America into a war with Cuba. I'm sure there's been many, many, many outlines and proposals of this sort. So we have that. Naval intelligence outlined their strategies for provoking Japan into attacking. Why would they do that? That included keeping the U.S. fleet on the ground as bait. And this was, an opportunity. So Richardson, now remember, Arthur McCullum of the Office of Naval Intelligence put that forward. He had his strategy, right? Then you had Richardson, Admiral James Richardson. He argued against placing the fleet at Pearl Harbor, citing that it was a foolish act. It was an absolutely vulnerable way to leave us open to attack. A heated exchange led to Richardson's dismissal, and he was replaced by Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, whose command was later the scapegoat for the incompetence and unpreparedness, air quotes for my listeners on Audible, at Pearl Harbor. The incompetence, that is like one of their favorite excuses. 9/11 was due to a lack of imagination and total incompetence. Everything is always due to incompetence. They would have you believe that they don't know, that they're just stupid, that it was just a failure of intelligence. October 7th, just a failure of intelligence. No, there's no such thing. Not anymore, not for a very long time. So we have clear record of the McCullum. So we have clear record. We have record of the McCullum memo, and we have clear record of the Richardson controversy. And we know that Richardson was then scapegoated for being unprepared at Pearl Harbor. So I want to take you to 1939, because through the incredible work and research of David Icke, I was able to uncover a lot more evidence that will show you, strongly support that, and for many of you with ears, blow this notion of a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor out of the water. That's a terrible, terrible pun I just used. Forgive me. Sometimes they just come out. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota said in 1939 that he had seen a series of volumes and read them called The Next War. I quote, The Next War. These included one that was entitled, quote, Propaganda in the Next War. And they were written before there was any talk of World War II. The material, Nye revealed, included the plan for manipulating public opinion into accepting American involvement in a second global conflict, and documents revealed said this, and I quote, to persuade her, the United States talking about, to take our part will be much more difficult, so difficult as to be unlikely to succeed. It will need a definite threat to America, a threat, moreover, which will have to be brought home to every citizen before the Republic again takes arms in an external quarrel. The position will naturally be considerably eased if Japan were involved, and this might and probably would bring America in without much further ado. At any rate, it would be a natural and obvious effect of our propagandists to achieve this, just as in the Great War, World War I, they succeeded in embroiling the United States with Germany. Fortunately, with America, our propaganda is on firm ground. We can be entirely sincere, as our main plank will be the old democratic one. We must clearly enunciate our belief in the democratic form of government and our firm resolve to adhere to the old goddess of democracy routine. End quote. That's from the documents which were revealed by General Nye and put on record. Crazy, 1939, right? So next, I have to mention, we're talking about Pearl Harbor. You need to understand the Council on Foreign Relations was heavily, heavily involved. What's the Council of Foreign Relations? For those of you who don't know, it is a non-government entity like so many that exist today, that was formed a long time ago. A parasite class organization is a front, of course, in the United States. And it was established by the Rothschild-Rockefeller-connected puppets in 1921. It has, in fact, to this day, been a major driver in American policy. What is the CFR? It's part of a web of satellite organizations spawned by a London-based secret society, which is known as the Round Table. And this includes the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the London-based Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as the Chatham House, and the Club of Rome. And for those of you who don't know about the Club of Rome, much research to be done, but let me just tell you one of their key creations was the idea, and they did this in the 60s, that they could exploit fears about the environment to justify their transformation of human society and reshaping of global government. Crazy. They take responsibility for that? Yeah, they do. Alas, my friends, that's why I'm mentioning it, because it is by and through the records that came from the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, that we're able to verify much of what they have sought to censor and keep from our history books. And it was the Council on Foreign Relations that devised the plan to antagonize Japan to such an extent that it would attack the United States and provide the excuse that America would need to enter the Second World War. So again, how do we verify some of this? Well, CFR founder Henry Stimson, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of War, wrote in his diary, quote, "We face the delicate question of diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure that Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad overt move," end quote. Why would he write that? So the CFR's War and Peace Studies Project sent a memo to Roosevelt suggesting that aid be given to China during its conflict with Japan, and that Japanese assets be frozen in the United States, and that a trade embargo be imposed. And Japanese should also, they said, be refused access to the Panama Canal. George Morgenstein's excellent book, Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War, reveals how Japan was goaded to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, absolutely goaded. Roosevelt, who took orders from the Council on Foreign Relations, set about provoking Japan into an attack with a number of measures and sanctions, which included targeting Japan's oil supplies. And that's not even to mention the fact that the United States military had been successfully decoding military transmissions of Japanese for almost 4 years before the attack. They knew the Japanese intended to alert diplomatic centers around the world of their decision to go to war, and they knew it was going to be through a false weather report during the daily Japanese language shortwave news broadcast. They knew what was going to be said. The forecast of, and I quote, east wind rain indicated a war with the United States, and, quote, west wing clear would mean a decision to go to war with Britain, and British and Dutch colonies together to go to war with both of them. And north wind cloudy was code for war with Russia. So they knew all that. And a congressional investigation that was heard in 1945 reveals, in fact, that the messages indicating a decision to go to war with the United States and Britain, though not with Russia, were intercepted and decoded on December 3rd, 1941, 4 days before Pearl Harbor. Plenty of time to clear on out of there, isn't it? These messages subsequently went missing from Navy files. Not suspicious at all. Almost like the surveillance cameras and the footage. Other decoded messages gave Roosevelt prior warning of the attack as well, but the public was not told that at all, and the people and the military craft in Hawaii were sitting ducks. They just didn't know it. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans and devastated much of our Pacific fleet. All for what? All for nothing. 2,400 Americans were killed for nothing. It could have easily been avoided, easily. Notably, the U.S. carriers were absent that day. I wonder why. Damage is fine, but we can't lose any of those. Those are huge and hard to make. So it was called magic code breaking, MAGIC, magic code breaking. It was diplomatic code destruction and withholding of intelligence, okay? In late 1941, intercepted intelligence revealed that Japanese diplomats in Washington had received orders to destroy all sensitive codes. You know what that is a sign of. It's a sign that was viewed typically as an indicator of imminent hostilities, imminent war. That's when they gave that code. The destruction of codes, along with other intercepted messages decoded through magic, strongly suggests an approaching attack. Despite this, the intelligence was withheld from Pearl Harbor's Admiral Kimmel and General Short. A year 2000 congressional investigation confirmed that Kimmel and Short were denied crucial intelligence that could have alerted them, and that led Congress to reverse their posthumous blame and conclude that those two were unjustly held responsible for what happened at Pearl Harbor. Just a little bit of evidence, you know. So some historians suggest, and I quote suggest, that Roosevelt may have anticipated the attack as a means to gain public support for the war. I wonder why. And they drew on the McClellan Memo and selective intelligence withholding as part of that strategy. Public reaction was clear. Pearl Harbor galvanized the American people. It dissolved all sentiment of neutrality and led to Congress to declare war on Japan. Germany and Italy's declarations followed, and that drew America into World War II. Let us return to 1933, Germany's Reichstag fire, because it wasn't just the Allied powers who were guilty of these false flags. The rise of Hitler, okay? 1933, January, amid Germany's economic crisis and fractured political environment, Hitler became chancellor. The Nazis moved swiftly to consolidate power, taking advantage of fears about social unrest and communism, okay? Fear of communism was all the rave, and Germany's wealthy industrialists saw Hitler as a stabilizing figure and a stronghold against communism. Western Europe shared that perspective, and many leaders in business circles viewed communism as a more immediate threat than Nazism. So the appeasement of Nazi Germany wasn't solely diplomatic. It was also benefited powerful industrial and banking elites in the UK and US who stood to profit from a resurgent Germany. And by tolerating Hitler's early aggression, Western governments and businesses created the conditions for German industry to expand and militarize. Leads us to the fire, the famous fire. On October 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building was set ablaze, and the Nazis blamed a Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, though many believe that the Nazis orchestrated the event themselves to justify what was to come next. Goebbels' propaganda machine framed the fire as part of a tremendous communist plot, the start of the communist problem in Germany, and that struck fear into the hearts of Germans. And this fueled domestic support for the reinforced Western perceptions of Hitler as a bulwark against communism. But what else did it do? It was a massive move, highly manipulative. Immediately after the fire, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which basically, to sum it all up, suspended all civil liberties granted by the German constitution. This allowed the Nazis to imprison their opponents en masse, to quote, eliminate the communist influence. Sound like the Patriot Act much? Terrorism? That's because that's exactly what it was. Just imagine every single civil right that you have suspended due to one act, the Patriot Act. I mean, the Reichstag Fire Act, the decree. And it was their term was the Enabling Act. So this was just weeks later. The Enabling Act granted Hitler legislative power without parliamentary approval. And that effectively ended German democracy. Unchecked control, Hitler centralized power and suppressed all opposition. Of course, this highly excited the financial parasite class. Why? Because they were directly benefiting from all this. By downplaying Hitler's actions, Western governments not only allowed Germany's military power to continue to mutate and grow, but they enabled industries with cross-national interests to thrive, and this facilitated Germany's complete rearmament. This cycle of appeasement and economic investment contributed to a dangerous buildup of Nazi power, needless to say. In the short term, Germany appeared as a deterrent to Soviet expansionism, but these actions ultimately armed an aggressive nation and primed it to initiate a global conflict, which is exactly what they were doing and what they wanted. The willingness to support a resurgent Germany under Hitler created the conditions that led to the very war that Western Europe had been claiming that it hoped to avoid. So I have 2 more false flags for you, but I'm going to save them, I believe, because of the runtime of this and because of how much information I just gave you. I'm thinking I'm going to save these 2, and I'll find one more to pair them with, and I'll do a part 3 of this series. If you enjoyed this special, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a comment and let us know. And if you're listening on iTunes, 5-star reviews help us grow. And we're already fighting a lot of algorithmic suppression. So I appreciate each and every one of your reviews. And if you have not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on all this information and videos that we are working hard to create for you. Much love to you, my friends. Stay tuned for part 3 of this series. I'm grateful for you and for your time, and I appreciate you listening to me, and gratitude. See you soon.